Welcome back to Monday Mod Tips. This is going to be a pitch for a new reoccurring series. One of the more common requests I get and emails that I get are people who have disassembled a blaster and can't figure out how to put it back together again. And so I thought I would start a series of videos where I disassemble a blaster and reassemble it and go into every possible detail, right down to which length screws go in which screw ports and all of that, and also discuss how the internals interact, which locks can be removed, what the locks do, all that sort of thing. I'm going to start with the Retaliator because it is one that I get commonly requested. It's still a fairly common blaster, fairly popular for modifications, and it does represent most of the magazine-fed springers that Nerf puts out. I will then have if this is a popular series and you want to see more of these, there will be a survey down in the video description where you can put in your votes for what blasters I should do. And the ones that get the most votes will be the ones that I will probably do next. This will probably be once or twice a month I'll put out one of these videos, because it is going to be fairly detailed and thus somewhat time-consuming. So, like I said, we're starting with the Retaliator. It is a top prime magazine-fed Springer. It has stock attachment point, barrel attachment point, all of the usuals. And let's get into it. Most Nerf blasters can be opened with a 0 or a 1 Phillips screwdriver. There unfortunately does not appear to be any exact industry standard on the sizes, so whatever screwdriver works. You don't want it to be too small or you risk stripping out your screw heads. If it's too large, it won't fit into the screw holes, so be aware of that. When you go to take the screws out, be sure to apply a good amount of pressure. And the first time you ever open a blaster, the screws are going to be very well seated. When they were put in quite solidly, and they probably tapped the screw ports as they went. So it is very tight, and you will need to apply plenty of pressure and twist. Often give it one good sharp twist to start, and you will often hear it pop as that original seal gets broken. And after that, they'll be much easier. But you still want to apply plenty of pressure. And you're going to be rotating counterclockwise, of course, because you're taking the screws out. Now, the majority of the screws in the Retaliator are all the same length. And I will get that length for you now. They're coming in at 8 millimeters. So they are 8 millimeter screws for the vast majority of it. There are a couple of exceptions. The first is going to be the 2 screws that are holding the stock attachment cap on. They are a larger screw. I recommend a slightly larger screwdriver so you don't accidentally strip out the screw heads. And while they are approximately the same length, they are still an 8 millimeter screw. They are slightly thicker, a coarser thread, and a larger head. So those 2 screws should be kept separately with your cap, and then most of the rest of them are that standard 8 millimeter. There is one additional screw that is different. Go ahead and get all of these out, all the ones that are the same. Now you will need to move the bolt because there are 2 screws underneath it. And now we finally get to the one odd screw, which is the one that is down here in this section. And why this one is so much longer, I honestly don't know. It doesn't seem necessary, but this one is a almost 16 millimeter. So it's twice the length. And that is the only one that is an odd size. All of the rest are that 8 millimeter, which is kind of odd because usually the screws that are up here in the rail have to be a little bit shorter in order to not poke all the way through the rail. But for this particular blaster, they decided to go with short ones everywhere. So for keeping your screws safe, you can leave them in the side of the shell that you're taking off. If you're going to be working on that side, you will need to take them out. If you still have the original instructions, you can put the screws in the instructions where they went. Alternatively, you can just put this on a sheet of paper and draw a rough outline around it and then put the screws into that piece of paper in order to keep track of them. I'm not going to be taking all of the stuff off of this side because it really isn't necessary, and so I will leave them on there. You will notice that the rail train. The rail tab did pop out. That is something to keep an eye on because those little springs like to spring, and if they're gone, they're gone. I have a bin full of them from blasters that I have disassembled in case I lose them, and it happens from time to time. Alright, so now we are into the internals. And it is a fairly complicated blaster. Not as complicated as some, but more complicated than, say, a single-shot Springer or anything along that line. There aren't a whole lot of internal springs. Or screws. There are only 3 screws on the inside of this. Well, I guess 7 if you want to get complicated, but let's take a look at some of them. So we're going to take out our main spring first. And at this point, I might zoom out a little bit so I can set things aside. Oh, that's zooming in. There we go. Alright, so starting in the back, we have our catch. And we will go into that in a little bit more detail. It just lifts out. Again, be careful not to lose the spring, because if you lose that spring, you're out of luck. We have our trigger. And again, watch out for the spring. We then have, this is the lock, one of the primary lock assemblies. Pretty much all of the locks are right in here, and they all kind of interact a little bit. And I will go into greater detail what all of those do as I put it back together. But they can simply be lifted out. Again, watch out for those springs springing. Now, this is our magazine release. It is spring-loaded, and the spring is on a separate piece that you can lift out, and I got lucky and caught the spring as it popped off of there. There is a tiny little plastic tab and the spring that is not held in by any glue or anything. You might choose to, but that gives you access to then remove the screw that holds the mag release in place. And that's just another, again, a regular size screw. Same for the one that's on the other side. The two lock together when you put the shell together, so that's one thing that will sometimes get a little stuck, is if the mag release isn't in the right position, you'll need to reposition it in order to close the shell. I'm going to leave that on there for this video, though. We then can remove the bolt assembly. So this has our plunger tube, plunger rod, bolt sled. All of that is all connected. They do come apart. The plunger tube will not come out. It is glued in place by this cap on the end, and that needs to remain. You cannot pull that off, which does make replacing this somewhat difficult unless you're replacing the whole assembly, which they do make replacements for all of this, of course. Now we get up into the front section, and we have 2 more screws that hold on the kind of the front part of the barrel. You'll need to pull down the dart tooth, and then you can remove that. Those are, again, 2 standard screws. They're the same as the ones that are on the exterior. So often Nerf blasters the interior screws will all be silver, where the outside ones are black. This is not the case for all of the ones in here. We then have our dart door or dart tooth, depending on which term you prefer. And it has a spring that is not well secured. Most of these are a little better secured. The springs won't just fall off, but this one it will, so be careful of that. It's a fairly light spring. There is then the part that holds it in place if you want to remove that, and this is one of the unusual screws. It is in fact a washer-headed screw, a broad screw. It's probably not going to focus, but that is what holds that in place. There are then 2 more on either side of the shell that hold the slide on, and I'm going to leave those on as well for now. You could remove the jam door if you wanted to, but not really necessary for the scope of this video. So I'm now going to start reassembling things and explaining how exactly they all interact. So we've got it down pretty much to the shell. The last remaining bits, the slide and the mag release, those are simple enough. You should be able to figure out how those go. But how all of the locks work is a little bit more complicated and is something that can be confusing to people who are just getting in to modding. So I'm going to go into considerably greater detail than I normally would for this section. And there will be pictures and there will be close-ups and all of that. So, alright, we will now proceed to reassembly, and I will go over what all the parts do. I'll have pictures of them and all of that. We're going to start with the front area because it has pretty much everything up there is necessary unless you're doing a sealed breach, but that is a whole different kind of mod. We will start with the barrel assembly. It goes in, and it is held in with 2 of the 8mm screws. So any of the ones that came out of the shell will work perfectly good here. Screw them down. Now we're going to put in our dart tooth, which is this part. And it's a little tricky to get it in there, but it goes in and under, and then you should be able to lock it into place. The spring goes in on the bottom, of course, and then our retention part, the part that keeps that from popping loose. This is one of the ones, again, that's held in by a non-standard screw. This one uses one of the washer-headed screws. And that goes in there. And the way this functions is when the bolt goes forward, this tab on the dart tooth is forced down, and then the bolt is able to force this spring-loaded door open. When those are in the locked position, the barrel is obstructed, and that way when the bolt slides forward over a dart, instead of the dart just getting pushed out of the barrel, it is forced into the bolt. And that is how it actually chambers it. And then once it's all the way seated, it will then force this down and the door open, and therefore clearing the barrel, and you will be able to fire. If this part gets too gummed up or jammed by something, say a bit of wood chip or grit or a Lego or something, gets up in there through the magazine well, and this isn't moving, that will cause jams. If it gets stuck in the down position, then the door won't get held closed, and you won't properly chamber darts. So you may want to check and make sure that that has not become obstructed or covered in grit. You can lubricate it, though it is not necessary, and adding lube may cause it to actually pick up dust and particles and whatnot. So as long as it can move freely, it should be fine. The next part we're going to be putting in is going to be the bolt. But first I'm going to discuss the lock that is built into the bolt. We're going to zoom in a little bit further, and hopefully this will work. On the bolt sled, on this back portion here, there is a lock. And you can see it pop up right there. This is the slide lock. This prevents you from pulling the slide back if the blaster is currently primed. So once you prime it and slide it forward again, it won't let you prime it again, and this is the lock that prevents that. The reason being, if you've already primed it and there's a dart in the barrel and you try to reprime it, you're going to be trying to cram another dart into the barrel, and you're going to jam it and possibly break your dart tooth, and it's not a good idea. The only time you would want to do that is if you were, say, firing half darts and wanted to double load or something along those lines. However, this lock does also prevent you from depriming the blaster. Once it is primed, you have to pull the trigger in order for this lock to get disengaged, which means you can't pull the slide back and then pull the trigger and ease the slide forward to deprime the blaster without firing it. And that is something that you want to be able to do if you've modified the blaster with a heavier spring, because dry firing the blaster can be bad. So to remove that lock, if you want to, there are 2 screws on the back here. They are a smaller screw. They are another one of the screws in the blaster that are different than the 8mm that are on the outside. But you don't have to take them all the way out. You just have to take them enough to get this cap off, a little bit more. And be careful, because there is a spring in there. And there is a small tab. So that is the internals for that. And by removing that, we have now made it possible for us to reprime, deprime, what have you, the blaster. Now, we're going to put those back in because we don't want that removed for this particular blaster because it is stock. So you just put it back in. The spring goes in there at kind of a weird angle, and the reason for that is that it is not just pushing this down, it also forces it forward. So when the tab gets pushed down, it causes that lip to hook over because that spring is at an angle instead of being straight up and down. So be aware that that is intentional, that spring is in there at a bit of an angle. It needs to be. There is a post on the inside of this that is going to hook onto that spring, and then you push the whole thing down and put your screws back in. Okay, now we can test it and make sure that it's still working. When this gets pushed down, it should clip into place. With that little tab, pushing that back should cause it to pop back up. So that is our slide lock. Let's install the bolt. The bolt it has holes on either side, and those need to line up with the posts that are on the slide itself. You can then push the whole assembly forward. You might have to actually engage that lock, and then you can slide it into place. Next, we will take a look at the plunger. So our plunger tube and plunger rod are all attached together, and they don't come apart easily. This cap on the back prevents you from being able to remove the plunger, and that is necessary, and we will see why when we go to look at how all of the locks interact. So the two tabs that are on here need to be pointed down. Those are the tabs that are going to disengage the slide lock. So the tab up here in the front, when this goes all the way forward and that clip pops up, this tab on the front of the plunger tube is what disengages the slide lock and allows the slide to go back. If that slide lock is not disengaged, it will catch on the shell and you cannot move the slide back at all. Once the plunger tube moves forward, so the plunger tube does slide, it does move as the blaster is operated. When it moves forward, it then pushes down on that tab, which disengages that lock, which allows you to slide it back. Once the bolt goes all the way back, which it won't properly engage that lock while the blaster is disassembled. But when you slide it back, the back tab on the plunger tube is what will engage the slide lock down. And this is what will allow you to then slide the bolt forward. This is why when you start priming the blaster, once you get past a certain point, you can't go forward until you fully prime the blaster. That is again because of that slide lock, which is why a lot of people will remove it, because it can cause some issues, especially with modified blasters. We are now going to put our catch in place. And you'll notice that the spring is offset, and that the spring needs to go down so that it is inside the shell and is holding everything in place. And again, make sure that the plunger tube is able to slide properly. Alright, now that we have the catch in place, I can explain how the movement of the plunger tube works and why it is necessary, and also why that ring on the back of the plunger tube is there to prevent the plunger from coming out. So, when the main spring is in place and the blaster is not primed, that spring forces the plunger tube forward. So it can slide, but when it's not primed, the plunger tube is being forced forward by the main spring. And as you can see right here, when the plunger tube moves forward, it disengages the slide lock enough for you to prime the blaster. When it's in the back position, that lock is engaged, and you cannot move the slide. Plunger tube moves forward, slide can now be moved back. When you force it all the way back, it not only moves the plunger back, but it also moves the plunger tube back. And that is necessary because if the plunger tube were forced forward, or wasn't able to move back, you wouldn't actually be able to get it, the plunger tube back, or the plunger, far enough back to actually catch. Now, once we have it all the way back and our slide lock disengages and slides forward, now because the plunger tube is being held back by the plunger, which is being held in place by the catch, the plunger tube cannot go forward and cannot disengage the slide lock. And so now that lock is in place, the blaster is primed, and you're ready to fire, assuming there was a dart in it. When you release the catch by pulling the trigger, this moves forward. Once it gets all the way forward, it hits the back of the plunger tube and forces the plunger tube forward, which then, once again, disengages our slide lock, and we can reprime the blaster. So it is, in fact, necessary for this to be able to move. Now, in some of the expanded plunger tube designs, they're expecting you to be using a sealed breech, and so they are expecting you to not have the slide lock at all, and so it's no longer necessary for the plunger tube to be able to move forward, and so they make it a little bit longer, which is how they get more volume. But it does still need to be positioned in such a way that the plunger can still get far enough back to catch. So if it is fixed, it needs to be fixed in the right position. If it's fixed too far forward, then the plunger won't actually get far enough back to catch. So be aware of that. Now we're going to get into some of the more complicated locks up in this section. And I will again I will zoom in so that we can get a good look at what's going on in there. The first thing that we are going to install is going to be our mag release spring. And it goes into here, the longer portion of the tab going down, I believe. And you can push it in there with a screwdriver, and it will then seat, and now our mag release has its spring. The next two locks that go in here are the mag release lock. It's vaguely U-shaped, and the 2 points are going to go down. And this is a somewhat tricky one to install, and you might want to get a flat-headed screwdriver or similar, because you are going to need to compress the spring in order to get it in there. There we go. Nope. Still didn't quite get it. As I said, this one can be a little tricky. There we go. And now that is spring-loaded. And what this does, this prevents you from removing the magazine, from pulling back on the mag release, if the bolt is not all the way back. And this is to prevent you from, it also will prevent you from putting in a magazine when the bolt is forward. And it will prevent you from pulling out the magazine when the bolt is forward, because that is not good for the blaster, because it'll either crack the lips on the top of your magazine, you can misalign your bolt, you can crack things on the inside. You don't want to try to pull a magazine out when the bolt is forward. So the way this works is the points on the top of that, on the top of the lock mechanism, engage with the tabs here on the front of the bolt sled as it comes sliding back. When it gets all the way back, it forces down the mag lock, and I'm having issues because nothing is being held in place properly, but it pushes down on the 2 tines on the top there, and it forces it, and now our magazine release is unlocked. And then as soon as it starts sliding forward again, now our mag release is locked again. And it will slide all the way back forward, hopefully. And then it remains locked. Or should. Now, our spring has come undone. That is something to be careful of. The spring can get sprunged if you move the internals while the blaster is open. There, now it's locked. We've also managed to lock our bolt. So, that is where that one goes. The next lock is your trigger lock. And once again, the spring goes down. And that goes right there. And it also interacts with the bolt sled. So when the bolt sled starts sliding back, it forces the trigger lock down, which will then lock the trigger. So here's the trigger. And this notch in the front is what gets locked by this trigger lock. So when the bolt starts coming down, this gets forced down, and now you cannot pull the trigger. So you cannot pull the trigger if the bolt is not all the way forward. And this prevents you from pulling the trigger while the bolt is back, because then when the spring goes, it's going to slam the whole bolt assembly forward, and that's not going to be good. It probably won't do any damage, but it won't properly operate, because it won't have chambered around, but the plunger is going forward, and it can jam the blaster and it can cause problems. So they designed it so you can't pull the trigger if the blaster is not fully in battery. However, that lock also prevents you from depriming the blaster. So the trigger lock and the slide lock in conjunction are what prevent you from being able to deprime the blaster. So if you want to be able to unprime the blaster, so it's already been primed, the spring is locked, and you want to be able to pull the slide back, pull the trigger, and then slide the slide forward, you have to remove the bolt sled lock and the trigger lock. You can leave the magazine lock in place, and I recommend that you do, because there really isn't, that I know of, any really good reason to remove it, because it prevents you from doing potential damage to the blaster. The other two are designed for that as well, but removing them gives you additional functionality, and functionality that is important if you're modifying the blaster to have a much heavier spring load and you want to be able to deprime the blaster. Those are the two locks that you need to remove. The final pieces to put in before we button this up is our slide tab lock thing, or rail tab, rail lock, and our main spring, which just goes in the back. Push it all the way forward, make sure everything is still seated properly, everything is still aligned. Any locks that need to be disengaged have been disengaged, and then you can put the shell back together. There is, I forgot to mention, this plastic piece, and it goes in the base of the handle and is part of the handle dart storage. There is a place in the handle to store a single dart, which I can only assume was simply a matter of, well, what do we do with the handle? Well, why don't we put some dart storage in there? It is also a place, if you primed the blaster and you want to deprime it, you'd have to fire it, the dart would come out, and if you don't want to put it back in the magazine, you can then store it in the handle. I assume that's how it goes. And now we simply put all of the screws back in. Remember, the only long one is this one in the bottom front corner. That is where our 16mm screw goes. And when you put the screws back in, it is vitally important that you rotate the screw counterclockwise until you feel it click and drop into place. That is the threads realigning. If you don't do this and the threads aren't aligned, you will do something that is called cross-threading, which damages the thread in the screw port. And if you do it too many times, the result will be that you will chew up all of the thread that is in the screw port, the screw hole, the post, and there will no longer be any grip, and the blaster and that screw will no longer have any purchase and will not work properly. So always rotate back until you feel it click, clunk, drop into place, what have you. Again, make sure that both sides of the mag release have lined up, because they might not. A lot of people will ask me why I don't use an electric screwdriver for disassembling blasters. For taking apart a blaster that has been taken apart multiple times before, I don't mind using an electric screwdriver to take the screws out. I very, very rarely will ever use an electric screwdriver to put the screws in, because the risk of stripping out the screw posts is not worth the couple of seconds that I'm going to save. Now, an example of what happens with too much cross-threading, these two screws, I do not believe I was the first person to open this, and there's enough purchase that the screw will go in and enough that the screw will go out, but you can just keep spinning forever and it will never actually lock in place because it has gotten stripped out. Alright, finally we get to our stock attachment cap, and again we are going to use the two larger headed, slightly coarser threaded screws. They clearly believed that this was enough of a load-bearing part that it deserved heavier screws, and I am with them on that. This is probably the most load-bearing spot on the blaster, other than the barrel attachment point, which is solidly screwed into place by a number of things. And I apparently missed a screw. Oh, yep, I missed the one back here. All right. Now we make sure that it still primes properly. It does. Still goes forward. Correct. All of the locks are still engaged. So once it goes forward, I cannot slide back until I pull the trigger, and the plunger goes forward just enough to disengage that lock. Once I get to here, I can't go forward anymore because of that slide lock. You have to go all the way back and it will click, and now I can go forward. Magazine release won't work while the slide is forward. You have to go all the way back. Now the magazine release will work. I cannot pull the trigger while the slide is back. It won't work. You have to slide forward and then it will fire. So that is how it should work in its stock configuration. So there is a very long, slow, fully detailed how to put this back together, what all the parts do, how they interact, what you can remove. And that's kind of the idea for this series. So if you guys think this is a good series and want me to continue it, let me know in the comments, and check out the survey to start adding what blasters you would like to see. The ones that get the most comments or most votes are ones that will go towards the top of the list. There may be ones that I don't have, or ones that I don't feel like doing, or ones that are similar enough to one that I've already done that I feel it would be redundant, but for the most part, I will go with what you guys would like to see. I know probably one of the high ones on the list is going to be the Sling Fire. I get a lot of requests for that, and for good reason. That is a complicated blaster. So let me know what you guys think, and I hope this was helpful. Thank you for watching. Train!